What would you do if you said something cruel about a stranger in a language you were sure they didn't understand, and they turned around and answered you in that same language, word for word, with a smile that told you they had heard every single thing you said? Vincenzo DeMarco found out on a Thursday night in a restaurant he had been visiting for 15 years. It was the night he learned that the quiet waitress with the coffee-stained apron wasn't who he thought she was. She wasn't who anyone thought she was, and the truth, when it finally came out, would destroy everything he had built. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comment section where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. Vincenzo DeMarco was the third generation of his family to run the DeMarco empire, and he was, by every measure, the most successful. His grandfather had started it, a Sicilian immigrant who arrived in America in 1947 with nothing but a knife and a name, who built a small loan operation in the Italian neighborhood that grew, over 40 years, into a criminal enterprise that controlled half the city's docks, its unions, and its construction contracts. His father had expanded it, taking the family into legitimate businesses, real estate, politics, philanthropy, while keeping the old operations running in the background like a quiet engine that no one talked about, but everyone depended on. And Vincenzo had perfected it. He had taken his father's semi-legitimate empire and polished it until it gleamed. He sat on museum boards. He donated to children's hospitals. He had a wing named after him at the university. His suits were hand-tailored in Milan. His smile was practiced in the mirror until it looked genuine. He was 52 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life becoming the kind of man that people wanted to trust, not the kind of man they feared. Fear was his grandfather's business. Trust was Vincenzo's, and trust, he had learned, was far more profitable. But there was one thing Vincenzo could never polish away, one thing that clung to him like the smell of garlic on his grandmother's hands. He was Sicilian, not Italian-American, not proud of his heritage. Sicilian, born in a village so small it didn't appear on maps, in a stone house with no electricity, delivered by a midwife who had also delivered his father and his grandfather before him. He had been brought to America when he was 6 years old, speaking only the dialect of his village, a dialect so old and so specific that even most Italians couldn't understand it. He had learned English in school, the way immigrant children do, fast, out of necessity, burying the old language under the new one, like a foundation you build a house on top of. By the time he was 30, Vincenzo spoke English with no accent at all. He had erased every trace of the village, every trace of the stone house, every trace of the boy who had arrived in America wearing clothes that didn't fit and shoes that had belonged to a dead cousin. He was American now. He was Vincenzo DeMarco, philanthropist, businessman, pillar of the community. The Sicilian village was a memory he never visited, except when he was angry. When Vincenzo DeMarco got angry, truly, deeply, genuinely angry, the English fell away like a mask he had been holding in place for decades, and what came out was the dialect of his village. Raw, ancient, vicious Sicilian, the language of men who had survived invasions and poverty, and centuries of being conquered by everyone, from the Greeks to the Normans to the Spanish. The language his grandfather had used to curse enemies, and his father had used to intimidate rivals, and his mother had used, just once, when a neighbor had insulted her cooking, in a tirade so terrifying that the neighbor had moved away the following week. Sicilian was not a language of diplomacy. It was a language of survival, and when Vincenzo was pushed past the limits of his carefully constructed American persona, It was the language that came roaring out. The restaurant was called La Tavola di Enzo, Enzo's Table. It was a small, family-owned place in the old neighborhood, the kind of restaurant that had been there for 50 years and would probably be there for 50 more. Red-checkered tablecloths, candles in wine bottles, a wood-fired oven that had been imported from Naples in 1972 and had never been turned off since. The owner, Enzo, was 83 years old and still came in every morning to make the pasta by hand. Vincenzo had been eating at Enzo's since he was a child. His father had eaten there, his grandfather had eaten there. The DeMarco family had a standing reservation, a table in the back corner, the one with the view of the kitchen, where Vincenzo could see everyone who came in and everyone who went out. It was his table. It had always been his table. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that. On the night everything changed, Vincenzo was in a terrible mood. He had spent the afternoon in a meeting with a rival family, the Castellanos, who had been encroaching on DeMarco territory for months, testing boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. The meeting had not gone well. It had been, in fact, the worst meeting of Vincenzo's career. The Castellanos were not just encroaching on DeMarco territory, they were systematically dismantling it. They had turned 3 of Vincenzo's long-time associates into informants. They had bought off 2 city council members who had been in the DeMarco pocket for decades. They had even approached Vincenzo's own brother-in-law. His wife's brother, a weak man with gambling debts, and convinced him to share information about the family's legitimate business holdings. The brother-in-law had been dealt with, quietly, permanently, but the damage was done. The Castellanos were led by a man named Rocco Castellano, a brutish, uninspiring man in his 60s, who had none of Vincenzo's polish but all of his ruthlessness. Rocco didn't care about museum boards or hospital wings. He didn't care about legacy or reputation. He cared about territory, about money, about power in its rawest form, and he had sensed correctly that Vincenzo's transition toward legitimacy had created vulnerabilities. The old DeMarco operations, the loans, the protection, the quiet machinery that had funded the legitimate businesses had been winding down for years. Vincenzo had been trying to go clean. Rocco had been trying to fill the vacuum. The meeting had taken place in a neutral location, a warehouse near the docks, a holdover from the old days that neither family controlled anymore. Rocco had arrived with 6 men. Vincenzo had arrived with 2. The imbalance was deliberate. Rocco wanted to show strength. Vincenzo wanted to show that he didn't need it. "You're losing your grip, Vincenzo," Rocco had said, leaning back in his chair with the smug confidence of a man who thought he was winning. "The old neighborhood doesn't respect you anymore. They see you on television, cutting ribbons at hospitals. They see you at charity galas, shaking hands with politicians. They think you've gone soft. They think the DeMarco name doesn't mean what it used to mean." "The DeMarco name means exactly what I decide it means," Vincenzo had replied. His voice was calm, the practiced calm of a man who had spent decades in negotiations far more dangerous than this one. The Castellano name, on the other hand, means a man who sends 6 bodyguards to a conversation with 2 men. "Which one of us looks weak, Rocco?" Rocco's smile had flickered, just for a moment, just long enough for Vincenzo to see it. The insult had landed. But Rocco recovered quickly. He was not as polished as Vincenzo, but he was not stupid either. "I'm not here to trade insults, Vincenzo. I'm here to make an offer. You're going to cede the docks to us, all of them. The loading contracts, the warehouse space, the union connections. In exchange, we'll leave your legitimate businesses alone. Your real estate, your construction contracts, your hospitals. You can keep playing the philanthropist. You just can't keep funding it with the old money. That money is ours now. Vincenzo had looked at Rocco for a long moment. 6 bodyguards, 2 of his own men. A warehouse near the docks. The Castellanos had planned this carefully. They had chosen the location, the timing, the intimidation tactics. They thought they had the upper hand. They were wrong. If I gave you the docks, Vincenzo said quietly, my grandfather would rise from his grave and kill me himself. He built those docks. He bled for those docks. He killed for those docks. And you, a Castellano, a family that wasn't even in this city when the De Marcos were running it, you want me to hand them over because you brought 6 men to a warehouse. Do you know what my grandfather would have done to 6 men in a warehouse? Rocco's smile had finally disappeared. Your grandfather is dead, Vincenzo. Your father is dead. You're the last De Marco standing, and you're standing alone. The words hit harder than Vincenzo expected. He was the last De Marco. His wife, Isabella, was a De Marco by marriage, not by blood. His children, his twin daughters, 18 years old, about to leave for college, were De Marcos, but they would never carry the name into the family business. Vincenzo had made sure of that. He had spent their entire lives keeping them away from the old operations. They thought their father was a real estate developer. They didn't know about the docks. They didn't know about the loans. They didn't know about the Castellanos, or the warehouse meetings, or the men who had disappeared. They thought the De Marco name meant philanthropy and hospital wings, and a wing at the university. They were innocent, and Vincenzo intended to keep them that way. My grandfather built an empire, Vincenzo said. My father expanded it. I perfected it. And you're a vulture picking at the edges, hoping something falls off. Nothing is going to fall off, Rocco. The docks are mine. They will always be mine. And if you or any of your 6 bodyguards sets foot on them again, you will find out exactly what the De Marco name still means. He had stood up. His 2 men had stood with him. Rocco's 6 bodyguards had tensed, hands moving toward their jackets, but Vincenzo had just smiled, the practiced smile, the one he had perfected in the mirror, and walked out. He had won the meeting. He had maintained his composure. He had defended the family name, but the words had followed him. Your grandfather is dead. Your father is dead. You're the last De Marco standing. And you're standing alone. That was what had sent him to Enzo's. Not just the anger, the loneliness, the weight of being the last one, the fear, unacknowledged, buried deep, that Rocco might be right, that the De Marco name was fading, that he had spent so long polishing the surface that he had forgotten how to fight. That the old Vincenzo, the village Vincenzo, the Sicilian Vincenzo, who could curse enemies and intimidate rivals, that man might be gone, replaced by a philanthropist who cut ribbons at hospitals and didn't know how to defend what his family had built. He had needed to go somewhere that reminded him of who he was. Enzo's, the restaurant his grandfather had eaten at, the restaurant his father had eaten at, the restaurant where the De Marco name still meant something. And instead he had walked in, sat down, and insulted a waitress who turned out to be his own blood. The irony was not lost on him. The De Marco name, the name he had been defending, the name Rocco had mocked, the name he had built his entire identity around, had just been claimed by a woman in a coffee-stained apron who had more right to it than he did. She was the daughter of the woman his grandfather had abandoned. She had been waiting 60 years for someone to acknowledge her. And he, the last De Marco, the polished philanthropist, the man who thought he was defending his family's legacy, had called her worthless. In Sicilian, the language of his village, the language she had learned specifically so she could answer him back, the Castellanos were right about one thing. The De Marco name didn't mean what it used to mean, but not for the reasons they thought. It didn't mean power anymore. It didn't mean fear. It meant a broken promise. It meant an abandoned woman. It meant 60 years of silence and an unmarked grave. It meant a waitress who had crossed an ocean to demand acknowledgement. And Vincenzo, the last DeMarco, standing alone, had just discovered that the name he had spent his entire life defending was built on a lie, or rather, on a stolen letter, on a burned truth, on a secret his grandmother had taken to her deathbed. The Castellanos were demanding concessions that Vincenzo would never grant. They were threatening consequences if he didn't cooperate. They were treating him like a weak man, a soft man, a man who had spent so much time on museum boards and hospital wings that he had forgotten how to fight. Vincenzo had maintained his composure during the meeting. He had smiled his practiced smile. He had spoken in calm, measured tones, but inside he was boiling. The Castellanos had insulted his family. They had insulted his father's memory. They had implied that the DeMarco name didn't mean what it used to mean. And Vincenzo, who had spent his entire life trying to be different from his father and his grandfather, had discovered, in that meeting, in that moment, that he was exactly like them. He wanted to crush the Castellanos. He wanted to destroy them. He wanted to reach across the table and show them what the DeMarco name really meant. He didn't do any of those things. He smiled. He nodded. He said they would continue the conversation another time, and then he got in his car and told his driver to take him to Enzo's. He needed food. He needed wine. He needed to be somewhere that reminded him of who he was. The waitress was new. Vincenzo noticed her immediately, because he noticed everything. It was a survival instinct, honed over decades of being a man who had enemies. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and a face that was pretty in an unremarkable way. She was heavyset, the kind of heavyset that came from good cooking and a metabolism that wasn't 20 anymore. She wore the standard uniform, white blouse, black apron, sensible shoes, and she moved through the restaurant with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. Her name tag said, Elena. Vincenzo didn't think about her again. She was just a waitress, one of hundreds of waitresses who had served him at Enzo's over the years. He sat at his usual table, ordered his usual wine, and tried to let the familiarity of the place calm the rage that was still simmering in his chest. Elena brought his wine. She poured it with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Will you be having your usual tonight, Mr. DeMarco?" she asked. Vincenzo looked up at her. Her English was perfect. No accent, completely American. "You know my usual," Enzo told me. "The osso buco, extra gremolata on the side. And you don't like the house bread. You prefer the ciabatta from the bakery on Mott Street. He has it brought in special for you." Vincenzo almost smiled. Enzo, the old man, had been serving his family for 50 years. He knew everything. "Yes, the usual," Elena nodded and walked away. Vincenzo watched her go, then turned his attention to his phone. There were messages to answer, problems to solve. The Castellanos were still threatening, still pushing, still testing. He typed out a response to his lieutenant, terse, controlled, calm, and then put the phone down and stared at the wall, and that was when the rage finally boiled over. He muttered it quietly. In Sicilian, a stream of insults about the waitress, her weight, her job, her presumption in knowing his order. He called her worthless. He called her nothing. He said his grandmother had cleaned floors for people like her. It was vicious and cruel, and exactly the kind of thing the old Vincenzo, the village Vincenzo, the Sicilian Vincenzo, would have said without thinking. He didn't mean it. Not really. He was just venting. He was just releasing the pressure. He didn't think anyone would understand. The dialect of his village was so old and so obscure that even most Italians couldn't follow it. An American waitress. She wouldn't understand a word. He was wrong. Elena was standing 3 feet away, holding his plate of ossobuco. She had returned from the kitchen while he was speaking. She had heard every single word, and her face was completely calm, the calm of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something to happen, and it has finally happened, and she is not surprised at all. She set the plate down in front of him. Then she straightened up, looked him directly in the eye, and spoke, in perfect Sicilian, the exact same dialect, the exact same village accent, every syllable flawless. You're wrong, Mr. DeMarco. My grandmother never cleaned floors. My grandmother was the woman your grandfather loved. Before he married your grandmother, he promised to marry her. He gave her a ring, and then he left her, pregnant, alone, in a village with no electricity, and sailed to America. He never came back. He never sent money. He never acknowledged the child. My grandmother died at 47, broken and forgotten, in the same stone house where your father was born. And her daughter, my mother, grew up knowing that the DeMarco fortune was built on a promise that was never kept. I've been waiting 15 years to look a DeMarco in the eye and tell him that, and now I have. The restaurant went completely silent, not because anyone else had heard. They hadn't. Elena had spoken quietly, intimately, directly to Vincenzo. The silence was Vincenzo's silence. The silence of a man whose entire understanding of his family, his legacy, his identity, had just been shattered by a waitress in a coffee-stained apron. Vincenzo stared at her. His face had gone pale. His hands were frozen on the table. The practiced smile, the one he had perfected in the mirror, was gone. What was left was the face of the village boy, the boy who had arrived in America in borrowed shoes, the boy who had been running from where he came from for his entire life. "What's your name?" he whispered. "Your real name?" "Elena DeMarco," she said. "My mother took the name. She said it belonged to us, more than it belonged to you. We've been waiting 3 generations for someone to come back to that village. No one ever did. So I came here instead. Vincenzo DeMarco, the 3rd generation, the most successful, the man who had perfected the empire, sat in his grandfather's favorite restaurant at his father's table and wept, not the controlled tears of a businessman managing his emotions. Real tears, the tears of a man who had just discovered that everything he had inherited, the money, the power, the name, was built on a broken promise a woman left behind. A child never acknowledged. A family that had been erased from the DeMarco story because it was inconvenient. And sitting across from him, in her coffee-stained apron, was the living proof. His cousin. His blood. The granddaughter of the woman his grandfather had abandoned. Elena didn't leave. She stood there, watching him cry, her face unreadable. She had been waiting for this moment for 15 years, since she was 10 years old, when her mother had first told her the story. She had imagined it 1,000 times. She had imagined Vincenzo DeMarco getting angry, denying everything, throwing her out of the restaurant. She had imagined him threatening her, bribing her, trying to make her disappear. She had imagined every possible reaction except this one. She had not imagined him weeping. "What do you want?" Vincenzo asked, his voice ragged. "Money? A share of the business? Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. My grandfather should have." "I don't want your money," Elena said. "I don't want your business. I grew up in that village. The same village you pretend doesn't exist. I know exactly what the DeMarco name is worth. I came here because I wanted you to know. I wanted someone in your family to finally acknowledge that we exist, that my grandmother existed, that she wasn't nothing, she wasn't worthless. She was a woman who was loved and then abandoned, and she deserved better. We all did." She turned to walk away. Vincenzo reached out and grabbed her wrist, not hard, not threatening, but desperate. the gesture of a man who was drowning and had just found something to hold on to. "Please," he said, "don't go. Tell me about her. Tell me about your grandmother. Tell me everything. And Elena, who had come to this restaurant expecting confrontation, expecting denial, expecting to walk out with her head held high and her anger justified, sat down. She sat down at Vincenzo DeMarco's table, the table that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before him, and she told him the story of the woman his families had erased. Her name was Lucia. She was 17 years old when she met Salvatore DeMarco, Vincenzo's grandfather. He was 22, handsome, ambitious, already planning his escape to America. He promised to marry her. He gave her a ring, a simple gold band that had belonged to his own mother. He told her he would send for her as soon as he was established in New York. She believed him. She was 17. She had never been more than 5 miles from her village. She didn't know that promises made by ambitious young men are the easiest kind to break. Salvatore sailed to America in the spring of 1947. Lucia discovered she was pregnant 2 months later. She wrote him letters, dozens of letters, sent to the address he had given her, a boarding house in Little Italy. None of them were ever answered. She didn't know that Salvatore had already met another woman, a Sicilian immigrant named Francesca, whose family had money and connections that Lucia's family didn't. He married Francesca 6 months after arriving in America. Lucia's letters were intercepted by Francesca's brother, who worked at the boarding house. They were burned, every single one. Lucia gave birth alone, in the stone house with no electricity, attended by the same midwife who had delivered Salvatore 23 years earlier. She named her daughter Rosa. Rosa grew up in the village, knowing she had a father somewhere in America who had never come back. She grew up watching her mother wait for letters, for money, for anything, and receive nothing. She grew up hungry. She grew up angry, and when she was old enough to understand, she made a promise to herself. Someday, someone in her family would find the DeMarcos. Someone would make them acknowledge what they had done. Rosa had a daughter. She named her Elena. And Elena grew up hearing the story of the grandmother she never met, the woman who had been loved and abandoned, the woman whose name had been erased from the DeMarco family history. Elena Ferrante, she used her mother's maiden name at the restaurant, not DeMarco, had been raised on a single story. It was the story her mother Rosa told her at bedtime instead of fairy tales. It was the story Rosa told her when she came home crying because the other children had mocked her worn-out shoes. It was the story Rosa told her on her 16th birthday, when Elena asked why they never visited America like the other families in the village. It was the only story that mattered. "You are a DeMarco," Rosa would say, holding Elena's face in both hands. "Never forget that. The DeMarco name was stolen from us. Your grandfather, my father, was a man named Salvatore DeMarco. He was the richest man in our village. He promised to marry my mother. He gave her this ring, and Rosa would touch the gold band on the chain around her neck, the same chain Elena now wore. He sailed to America and never came back. He married another woman. He had another family. He built an empire, and we were left here, forgotten." Erased. Elena grew up in the shadow of that story. It colored everything. The way she felt about the stone house, the same house her grandmother had died in, the same house where her mother had been born, the same house where Elena herself had been born. It was a house filled with ghosts. The ghost of Lucia, who had waited at the window for a ship that never came. The ghost of Salvatore, who had promised and never delivered. The ghost of the life they could have had if one man had kept his word. The village was called Santa Lucia del Mare, Saint Lucy of the Sea. It was perched on a hillside overlooking the Ionian, a cluster of stone houses that had been there for 500 years, unchanged by time. The same olive trees, the same church bells, the same narrow streets where old women sat in doorways and watched the world go by. It was beautiful, and Elena hated it. She hated it because it was a prison. She hated it because everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew the story of Lucia DeMarco, the woman who had been abandoned by the rich American. She hated it because her mother had never left, had never been able to leave, because there was no money and no opportunity and no way out. Rosa had worked her entire life. She cleaned houses, she washed laundry, she picked olives during the harvest season, her hands raw and bleeding from the work. She never complained, she never asked for help. She was proud, fiercely, stubbornly proud, and she refused to accept charity from anyone. When the village priest offered to help pay for Elena's school supplies, Rosa refused. When a neighbor offered to give them his old car, Rosa refused. When a charity organization from the mainland offered to sponsor Elena's education, Rosa refused. "We are DeMarcos," she said. "We don't take charity. We survive on our own." Elena loved her mother. She also resented her. She resented the pride that kept them poor. She resented the story that defined their lives. She resented the name DeMarco, a name that had brought them nothing but grief, a name that belonged to a family in America that didn't even know they existed, and she resented the ring, the gold band that Rosa wore on a chain around her neck, that she touched every night before she went to sleep, that she would never sell no matter how desperate things got. Lucia's ring, Salvatore's broken promise, preserved in gold. When Elena was 15, she made a decision. She was going to find the DeMarcos. She was going to go to America. She was going to look them in the eye and make them acknowledge what they had done, not for money, not for revenge, for acknowledgement. For Lucia, for Rosa, for herself. She started learning English from an old textbook she found in the village school. She practiced with American movies. She watched on a borrowed television. She studied the DeMarco family, reading everything she could find online at the village's single internet cafe, Vincenzo DeMarco, philanthropist, businessman, museum board member, hospital wing donor, the third generation, the most successful, the man who had perfected the empire his grandfather had started. She learned his restaurants, his habits, his schedule. She learned about Enzo's, the restaurant his family had been visiting for 50 years. She learned that Enzo hired new staff every summer. When she was 25, she applied. She flew to America on money she had saved for 10 years. Waitressing in the village cafe, cleaning houses alongside her mother, picking olives until her hands bled. She arrived in New York with a single suitcase and the gold ring on a chain around her neck. She got the job at Enzo's. She waited, and she waited, and she waited. For 6 months, Elena served Vincenzo DeMarco his osso buco. 6 months of watching him from across the restaurant. 6 months of pouring his wine and remembering his bread preference and smiling her practiced smile. 6 months of waking up in her tiny apartment in Queens, looking at the ring on her chain, and wondering if today would be the day. The waiting was harder than she expected. She had imagined the confrontation would happen quickly, that she would reveal herself within weeks, that the moment would present itself, that her 15 years of preparation would pay off almost immediately. But the moment didn't come. Vincenzo was always surrounded by business associates, by family, by the invisible wall of wealth and power that separated him from the people who served him. He was polite, he was calm, he never raised his voice, he never lost his temper, he never gave her an opening. So she waited. She learned his patterns. She learned that he came to Enzo's twice a week, Thursdays and Sundays, always at the same time, always at the same table. She learned that he ordered the osso buco every time, never deviating, as if the ritual was more important than the food. She learned that he tipped generously, 25%, always in cash, never making eye contact with the server when he did it. She learned that he checked his phone constantly, that he never stayed longer than an hour, that he always left through the back entrance where his driver was waiting. She learned everything about him except the thing she most wanted to know. Was there a crack in the armor? Was there a moment when the mask would slip? She got her answer on a Thursday night, 6 months after she started, when Vincenzo walked in alone, his face dark, his shoulders tight, his practiced smile nowhere to be found. He had just come from the Castellano meeting. He was angry, angrier than she had ever seen him, and when he muttered those words in Sicilian, cruel words, dismissive words, words that reduced her to nothing, she didn't feel hurt, she felt relief. Finally, the crack, the opening, the moment she had been waiting for. She had rehearsed her response 1,000 times. In her apartment, in front of the mirror, she had practiced the Sicilian phrases until they flowed like water. She had imagined every possible reaction, anger, denial, threats, bribes. She had prepared for all of them. What she had not prepared for was the truth, the letter, the burning, the grandmother who had intercepted it, the grandfather who had died not knowing. As she stood at his table, holding his osso buco, delivering the speech she had been rehearsing for 15 years, Vincenzo De Marco did something she had never anticipated. He told her a story she had never heard, a story that changed everything. And in that moment Elena realized that she had not come to America for revenge. She had not come for money. She had not come to punish the De Marco family for what they had done. She had come because she needed to know. She needed to know if Salvatore De Marco was a monster who had abandoned his pregnant fiancée without a second thought, or if he was something else, something more complicated, something more human. She needed to know if the anger she had carried her entire life was justified. And the answer, it turned out, was both. Salvatore was not a monster, but he was not innocent either. He was a man who had made a promise and failed to keep it. Not through malice, but through circumstance. Through the cruelty of a jealous woman, through a letter that was burned, through a truth that was hidden. He had died not knowing, and that, the not knowing, was perhaps the cruelest part of all. For him, for Lucia, for everyone who had been caught in the wake of a single broken promise. Elena looked at Vincenzo, really looked at him, and saw not the polished philanthropist, not the third-generation mobster, not the man who had insulted her in Sicilian. She saw a man who had just learned that everything he believed about his family was built on a secret. A man who was, in his own way, as lost as she was. A man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to tell him the truth. She poured his wine. She remembered his bread preference. She smiled her practiced smile, the one she had perfected in the mirror, just like him. And every time she set down his plate, she thought about Lucia, about Rosa, about the stone house, and the unmarked grave and the 60 years of waiting. She thought about the ring on the chain around her neck, the same ring Salvatore had given Lucia, the same ring that had been passed down through 3 generations of abandoned women. She was waiting for the right moment. She didn't know what it would look like. She just knew she would recognize it when it came, and it came on a Thursday night when Vincenzo De Marco, angry, unguarded, his polished American mask slipping, insulted her in the language he thought no one else remembered. And she answered him, flawlessly, every syllable a reminder, every word a reckoning. When Elena was 10 years old, her mother took her to the village cemetery and showed her Lucia's grave. It was small, unmarked, neglected. "This is what the DeMarcos did to us," Rosa said. "Remember this. Remember her, and one day when you're ready, go find them. Not for revenge, for acknowledgement. Make them say her name. Elena never forgot. She learned English. She learned Sicilian. The old dialect, the village dialect, the one the DeMarcos thought no one else remembered. She studied the DeMarco family. She learned about Vincenzo, his businesses, his philanthropy, his carefully constructed reputation. She learned about Enzo's restaurant. She applied for a job there, using her mother's maiden name so no one would recognize the DeMarco connection. She got hired. She waited. She learned his order. She learned his schedule. And she waited for the right moment. The moment came on a Thursday night, when Vincenzo DeMarco, angry, unguarded, his mask slipping, insulted her in the language he thought no one else spoke. And she answered him, flawlessly, in the exact same dialect, in the exact same village accent, every syllable a reminder of the woman he had never known existed. Vincenzo listened to all of it, the entire story, every painful detail, and when Elena finished, when the last word had been spoken, and the restaurant was quiet, and the ossobuco had gone cold on the plate between them, he did something that surprised them both. He took off his watch. It was a Patek Philippe, worth more than most people made in a year. He pushed it across the table toward Elena. "Sell it," he said. "Use the money to put a proper stone on your grandmother's grave. With her name, Lucia DeMarco. She deserves that much." Elena looked at the watch. Then she looked at Vincenzo. "I told you, I don't want your money." "It's not my money. It's her money. She was a DeMarco. She was owed a share of everything this family built. This is nothing compared to what she deserved, but it's a start." Elena didn't take the watch. Not that night. But she didn't leave either. She stayed at the table, and they talked about the village, about the stone house, about the midwife who had delivered 3 generations of DeMarco babies, about Lucia's favorite song, about the olive tree she used to sit under, about the ring Salvatore had given her, a simple gold band that Lucia had worn until the day she died 60 years ago, the ring that Rosa had kept in a small wooden box by her bed, that she had touched every night before she went to sleep, that she had never sold no matter how hungry they were. The ring that Elena had carried across the ocean, on a chain around her neck, waiting for this exact moment. Vincenzo stared at the ring. He had never seen it before, but he had heard about it. His father had told him the story once, late at night, when the wine had loosened his tongue. "Your grandfather left a woman in Sicily," his father had said. "He never talked about it, but your grandmother knew. She found a letter once, the only letter that got through. It was from a woman named Lucia. She was pregnant. She was asking him to come back." Your grandmother burned the letter. She never told your grandfather it arrived. She was afraid he would leave. She was afraid she would lose everything. She carried that guilt for the rest of her life. She told me on her deathbed. She made me promise to tell you. She wanted someone in this family to know. So now you know. Vincenzo had been 25 when his father told him that story. He had buried it. The way he buried everything that connected him to the village, to the old country, to the messy, complicated history of his family. He had told himself it didn't matter. It was ancient history. It had nothing to do with him, but now, sitting across from him, was a woman wearing his grandfather's ring, and the ancient history was very much alive. "My grandmother burned the letter," Vincenzo said. His voice was barely a whisper. "The one your grandmother sent. The one saying she was pregnant. My grandmother intercepted it. She burned it. My grandfather never knew. He died not knowing he had a daughter." Elena's face didn't change. She had been prepared for denial. She had been prepared for anger. She had not been prepared for this. For Vincenzo to already know. for the truth to be worse than she had imagined. He didn't abandon her, Vincenzo continued. He was tricked by his own wife, my grandmother. She was afraid of losing him, so she made sure he never found out. He died thinking Lucia had forgotten about him, that she had moved on, that she had never loved him at all. He died with the wrong story. Elena was silent for a long moment. 60 years. 60 years of anger, of resentment, of carrying the weight of abandonment. And the truth was not that Salvatore De Marco was a monster. The truth was that he was a man who had been betrayed by his own wife, who had died not knowing, who had never gotten the chance to do the right thing. So it was her, Elena said. Your grandmother, she's the reason my grandmother died waiting. Yes, Vincenzo said, and she carried the guilt for the rest of her life. She told my father on her deathbed. She made him promise to tell me. She wanted someone to know. She wanted someone to make it right, and I never did. I buried it, like I buried everything. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Elena looked down at the ring on her chain. Lucia's ring. Salvatore's promise. 3 generations of waiting, and the answer was not cruelty. It was cowardice. A woman afraid of losing her husband. A letter burned. A secret kept. And 60 years of suffering that could have been avoided if one person had been brave enough to tell the truth. My grandmother would have forgiven him, Elena said quietly. If she had known, she would have forgiven him. She loved him. She never stopped loving him. She just wanted him to come back. She just wanted him to know about the baby. She just wanted to not be forgotten. She looked up at Vincenzo. She got her wish, tonight. You know now, the waiting is over. Vincenzo reached across the table. He didn't touch the ring. He wasn't worthy of touching the ring, but he placed his hand on the table beside it, palm up, an offering. I can't undo 60 years. I can't bring back your grandmother. I can't give your mother the childhood she deserved. But I can make sure the name is never forgotten. I can make sure Lucia De Marco is remembered. I can put a stone on her grave. I can tell my children the truth about their grandfather. I can do what my father should have done. What my grandmother should have done. What I should have done the moment I heard the story. I can try. Let me try. Elena looked at his hand. Palm up. Open. Waiting. The hand of a man who had spent his entire life taking opportunities, taking power, taking whatever he needed to build his empire. And now, for the first time, he was offering, not money, not a payoff, an acknowledgement, an apology, a promise to do better. She didn't take his hand, not yet. But she didn't leave either. She stayed at the table, and they talked until the restaurant closed. Old Enzo, who had been watching from the kitchen, who had seen the tears and the ring and the reckoning, came out and sat with them. He was 83 years old. He had known Salvatore. He had known the story. He had kept the secret for 50 years. I knew about Lucia, Enzo said. Salvatore told me once. Late at night, after too much wine, he said there was a woman in Sicily he should have married. He said he never stopped thinking about her. He said he wrote her letters, but she never answered. He thought she had moved on. He thought she had forgotten him. I never told him the truth. I didn't know the truth. I just knew he was sad. I just knew he regretted something. I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed. I'm sorry. The 3 of them sat at the table. The heir, the abandoned, and the witness, and for the first time in 60 years, the story was told in full, all the pieces, the promise, the ring, the letter, the burning, the waiting, the death, the passing down through generations, the journey across the ocean, the night in the restaurant, the insult, the answer, the reckoning. It was almost dawn when they finally stood up to leave. The restaurant was dark. The candles had burned down to nothing. The osso buco was still on the plate uneaten, cold. Vincenzo looked at Elena. His cousin, his blood, the woman who had crossed an ocean to hold his family accountable. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Elena said, "you keep your promise, and I go home, not to the village, to my mother, to Rosa. She's been waiting 60 years for someone to say Lucia's name. She deserves to hear it from me." She paused. "And then, when you're ready, you come to Sicily. You see the grave. You meet your family, the family you never knew you had." Vincenzo nodded. "I'll be there, I promise." And this time, the DeMarco promise was kept. 2 weeks later, Vincenzo DeMarco, the third generation, the most successful, the man who had perfected the empire, flew to Sicily with his cousin Elena. They drove to the village that didn't appear on maps. They walked to the cemetery on the hill. They stood in front of Lucia's grave, a small, unmarked mound of earth, overgrown with weeds. Rosa was there. She was 60 years old, her face weathered by sun and work and decades of waiting. She had never left the village. She had never stopped hoping. And now, standing in front of her mother's grave, she was meeting the grandson of the man who had broken her mother's heart. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just looked at Vincenzo, really looked at him, and saw, in his face, the ghost of Salvatore, the same jaw, the same eyes, the same blood. "Welcome home," Rosa said. Her voice was rough, cracked with emotion. "It took you long enough." Vincenzo fell to his knees, right there in the dirt, in his expensive suit, in front of the unmarked grave of the woman his family had erased. He didn't care about the suit. He didn't care about the dirt. He cared about the woman in the ground, who had waited 60 years for someone to say her name. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry for everything my family did. I'm sorry for everything we didn't do. I'm here now. I'm here." Rosa looked down at him, the richest man in her family, kneeling in the dirt of her mother's grave. And after 60 years of waiting, she finally let herself cry. Not tears of anger, not tears of resentment, tears of release, tears of a promise finally kept, tears of a name finally spoken. He paid for the headstone, Lucia DeMarco, white marble. "Sempre t'aspetai, I always waited for you." He paid for the restoration of the stone house. He paid for a school named after her. He couldn't undo the past, but he could honor the woman who had been erased from it. And he did. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, he visited the grave. Every year he brought flowers. Every year he said her name, Lucia, Lucia DeMarco. The woman his family had tried to forget, the woman he would spend the rest of his life remembering. A simple gold band that she had worn until the day she died, and that Rosa had kept, and that Elena now wore on a chain around her neck. She pulled it out and showed it to Vincenzo. He recognized it immediately. It was the ring his grandfather had described in the only letter he ever wrote about the old country, a letter Vincenzo had found after his father died, tucked into a Bible unread for decades. "She kept it," Vincenzo whispered. "All those years, she kept it." "She loved him," Elena said, "until the day she died. She never stopped loving him. That's the worst part, not that he left, that she never stopped waiting." Vincenzo closed his eyes. The weight of 3 generations, the money, the power, the reputation, the museum boards and the hospital wings and the hand-tailored suits, all of it suddenly felt like nothing, like dust, like the borrowed shoes he had worn off the boat when he was 6 years old. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was this woman sitting across from him, his cousin, his blood, and the grandmother whose grave had been unmarked for 60 years. "I want to go there," he said, "to the village, to her grave. I want to see it." Elena studied his face. She had spent 15 years imagining this moment. She had imagined every possible reaction except this one. The monster she had prepared to confront was not a monster at all. He was just a man who had inherited a fortune built on a broken promise, a man who had spent his entire life running from where he came from, a man who was now, for the first time, turning around to face it. "Then come," she said. "I'll take you," and they went. 2 weeks later, Vincenzo de Marco, the third generation, the most successful, the man who had perfected the empire, sat in economy class on a flight to Palermo. He had never flown economy in his life. He had wanted to. He needed to. He needed to feel what it felt like to be ordinary, to be small, to be someone who didn't have a private jet waiting on the tarmac. Elena sat beside him. She had refused to let him pay for her ticket. She had bought her own, with money she had saved from 6 months of waitressing at Enzo's. "This journey is mine," she said. "You can come with me, but you can't buy it for me." Vincenzo had respected that. He was learning to respect a lot of things he had never respected before. The flight was 7 hours. They talked for most of it, not about the business, not about the Castellanos or the docks or the empire, about the village, about Lucia, about Rosa, about the stone house and the olive trees and the church bells that rang every hour, about the midwife who had delivered 3 generations of De Marco babies. About the ring on Elena's chain, the simple gold band that had been passed down through 3 generations of abandoned women that had crossed an ocean twice that was finally going home. "I used to hate that ring," Elena said. "When I was a teenager, I used to tell my mother to sell it. We needed the money. We always needed the money." And she would say, "Never. This ring is proof that we existed, proof that we mattered, proof that someone loved us once." I didn't understand. I just saw a piece of metal that could buy food. But now I understand. She was holding on to the only evidence that the De Marcos had ever acknowledged us. Even if the acknowledgement was a broken promise, it was still proof. It was still something. Vincenzo looked at the ring, the simple gold band unadorned, worn smooth by decades of being touched. My grandfather gave her that ring. He probably bought it with money he saved for months. He was poor. Everyone in the village was poor. That ring was probably the most valuable thing he owned, and he gave it to her. Before he left, before everything went wrong, he loved her, whatever else happened. Whatever secrets were kept and letters were burned, he loved her. That ring is proof of that too. Elena touched the ring on her chain. I never thought of it that way, as proof of love. I always thought of it as proof of betrayal. "Maybe it's both," Vincenzo said. "Maybe that's what family is. Proof of love and proof of betrayal, all mixed together. Maybe nobody's hands are completely clean. Maybe the best we can do is try to wash them." They landed in Palermo in the early morning. The sun was rising over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Elena had seen 1,000 times as a child, but had never appreciated until she left. They rented a car, a small, battered Fiat that coughed and sputtered on the mountain roads, and drove 3 hours inland, through villages that got smaller and smaller until the roads turned to dirt and the GPS stopped working. "There's no signal here," Vincenzo said, looking at his phone. The screen was blank. For the first time in decades, he was unreachable. No calls, no messages, no Castellanos, no empire. Just the mountains and the olive trees, and the woman beside him who shared his blood. "Good," Elena said. "The village has been waiting for you. It can wait a little longer." The village was exactly as she had described it. A cluster of stone houses on a hillside, overlooking the Ionian Sea. Olive trees everywhere, ancient, gnarled trees that had been standing for centuries. The church bells rang every hour just as she had said. Old women sat in doorways, watching the world go by. Children played in the narrow streets. It was beautiful, and it was poor. The kind of poor that Vincenzo had escaped when he was 6 years old, that he had spent his entire life trying to forget. The kind of poor that Elena had grown up in, that had shaped her, that she had crossed an ocean to escape. They parked the Fiat at the edge of the village and walked. Elena led the way. She knew every street, every house, every face. People called out to her as she passed. "Elena, you're back! Your mother said you were in America!" She waved and smiled and kept walking. She was not here for a reunion. She was here for a reckoning. The cemetery was on a hill above the village, overlooking the sea. It was small and old, with grave markers dating back 200 years. Some were elaborate, marble headstones with carved angels and family crests. Most were simple. A wooden cross, a name, a date, and then there was Lucia's grave. Unmarked, overgrown, forgotten. A small mound of earth with weeds covering it, indistinguishable from the ground around it. If you didn't know it was there, you would walk right past it. Elena stopped in front of it. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stood there, looking at the unmarked earth that contained the grandmother she had never met, the woman whose story had defined her life. Vincenzo stood beside her. He didn't speak either. What was there to say? Words couldn't fix 60 years of neglect. Words couldn't bring back the woman who had waited at the window for a ship that never came. Rosa was already there. She had been waiting for them. She was 60 years old, her face weathered by sun and work, her hands rough from decades of cleaning and picking olives. She was standing in front of her mother's grave, holding a single white rose. The same kind of rose that Lucia had carried at her wedding, the wedding that never happened. She looked at Vincenzo. She looked at Elena. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The three of them stood together in front of the unmarked grave. The heir, the abandoned, and the daughter who had waited her entire life for someone to say her mother's name. Vincenzo knelt in the dirt. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most people in this village would earn in a lifetime. It didn't matter. He knelt in the dirt, in front of the grave of the woman his family had erased, and he wept. Not the controlled tears of a businessman managing his emotions. Real tears. Ugly tears. The tears of a man who had just discovered that everything he believed about himself, about his name, his legacy, his identity, was built on a secret. And he was sorry. He was so sorry. For everything. For his grandfather who never knew. For his grandmother who burned the letter. For his father who buried the truth. For himself, who had spent his entire life running from the village and the language and the history, trying to become someone else. And for Lucia, the woman in the ground, the woman who had waited, the woman who deserved better, Vincenzo DeMarco, the third generation, the most successful, the man who had perfected the empire, flew to Sicily with his cousin, Elena, the waitress from Enzo's restaurant. They drove to the village that didn't appear on maps. They walked to the cemetery on the hill. They stood in front of Lucia's grave, a small, unmarked mound of earth, overgrown with weeds, forgotten by everyone except the daughter and granddaughter, who had never stopped remembering. Vincenzo knelt in the dirt. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most people in this village would earn in a lifetime. It didn't matter. He knelt in the dirt, and he wept. For Lucia, for his grandfather, for the broken promise that had shaped 3 generations of 2 families, and then he made a promise of his own. He paid for the headstone, a beautiful one. White marble, with her name, Lucia DeMarco, and the dates of her birth and death, and underneath a single line in Sicilian, Sempre t'aspettai. I always waited for you. He paid for the restoration of the stone house. He paid for a school in the village, named after Lucia. He paid for scholarships for the village children, so they could leave if they wanted to, or stay and build something better. He paid for everything his grandfather should have paid for 60 years ago. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to repair some of the damage. Elena stayed in America. She didn't want to go back to the village, not permanently. She had spent her whole life trying to leave, but she stayed in Vincenzo's life. She became family, not the kind of family you're born into, the kind you choose. She came to Sunday dinners. She met Vincenzo's children. She told them the story of their great-grandmother Lucia. The story that had been erased from the family history, that no one had ever told them. She made sure the name was remembered. She made sure the grave was never neglected again. And Enzo, old Enzo, who had been serving the DeMarco family for 50 years, who had seen everything and said nothing, he was the one who finally told Vincenzo the truth about the letters. About how Francesca's brother had intercepted them. About how his grandfather had died not knowing that Lucia was pregnant, not knowing that he had a daughter, not knowing that his promise had been stolen from him by someone else's cruelty. Your grandfather wasn't a monster, Enzo said. He was a man who made mistakes. But he didn't abandon her. He was tricked. He died not knowing. You need to know that. Vincenzo didn't know what to do with that information. It didn't change what had happened to Lucia. It didn't change the 60 years of neglect. It didn't change the unmarked grave or the broken woman who had died waiting. But it changed something in him. It changed the way he thought about his family, about his legacy, about the name he had spent his entire life trying to live up to. The DeMarco name wasn't cursed, it was just human, flawed, broken, capable of both great cruelty and great love, like all names, like all families, and here is what I want you to take from this story. There is a version of you that someone is still waiting for, a promise you made that you forgot about, a person you hurt without knowing, a letter you never received because someone else burned it. And there is also a version of you that can go back, that can kneel in the dirt and weep, that can put a stone on an unmarked grave, that can say the words that should have been said decades ago. You cannot undo the past, but you can acknowledge it, you can honor it, you can make sure the names that were erased are never forgotten again, because Lucia DeMarco deserved better, and so does whoever is waiting for you. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the promises you've made and the people you've left behind, please take a second to like this video. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell so you never miss another story. Tell me in the comments, is there someone in your family whose story was never told? I read every comment. We tell stories here about family, about legacy, about the moments when the past catches up with the present, and we have so many more coming. Until next time, remember Lucia DeMarco, remember that someone is always waiting, and it's never too late to go back.